Florence, in the year 1400. If you were to walk the stone bridges over the Arno and step into the narrow streets, you might at first mistake this city for any other in Italy. 500,000 souls packed tightly into walls of brick and ochre, the smell of wet wool from the dyeing vats rising into the morning air, the endless sound of bells from the cathedral tolling the hours. But if you had walked these streets then, with your eyes open to money, with an understanding of how power flows and settles, you would have seen something remarkable happening in the counting houses and banks hidden behind ordinary stone facades. In one such building, you would find men sitting by candlelight into the evening hours, bent over ledgers of vellum and ink, their quills moving steadily across the pages, inventing the modern world with every number they wrote. They were not soldiers or priests or philosophers, they were bankers. And one family, the Medici, had discovered something that would prove to be far more powerful than any army, more durable than any king's decree, more subtle and penetrating than any form of political power the world had known before. They discovered that if you controlled the money, you controlled everything else. You controlled who could build, what could be built, whose ideas would live and whose would die, whose talents would flourish and whose would wither. And they set out to control not just money, but beauty itself, buying artists, commissioning buildings of impossible ambition, purchasing the devotion of popes, and ultimately purchasing a place in history that has lasted 600 years and will likely last for 600 more. This is the story of how one Florentine family, by understanding the true power of banking and the true and redemptive purpose of beauty, came to remake an entire age. To understand the Medici, you must first understand Florence. And to understand Florence in 1400, you must understand wool. The city sat inland from the Mediterranean coast, away from the great sea trade routes that connected the ports of Venice and Genoa to the Orient and to the Islamic world. Away from easy access to commerce and the sea, Florence had to create its own wealth through ingenuity. But it had something nearly as valuable as a location on the coast. It had sheep in the rolling hills of Tuscany, and it had centuries of accumulated skill in dyeing and finishing cloth. For generations, two complementary guilds had controlled Florence's textile destiny. The Arte della Lana, the Guild of Wool Workers, imported raw fleece directly from the sheep farms of England, bringing whole bales of the finest English wool across the northern seas at great expense. The merchants would haggle with English farmers, bargaining over quality and price, knowing that the whitest, softest fleece commanded premium rates. This wool arrived in Florence raw, unfinished, waiting. Meanwhile, the Arte di Calimala, the more prestigious guild of cloth importers, had pioneered a parallel trade. They brought already woven cloth from the prosperous cities of Flanders and Brabant, from the weaving centers of northern France. But neither guild alone could create Florence's true advantage. The magic lay in finishing, in what happened along the Arno in the evening hours, when the dyeing vats released their steam and smoke into the cooling air. In the workshops along the river, the real alchemy occurred. English fleece was carded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. Then it entered the vats. The dyers of Florence, men trained in secrets, passed down through generations, used imported mordants and crushed insects and plant materials to create colors that made other cities' textiles seem dull and lifeless. Crimsons from cochineal, purples from madder root, steeped in precise temperatures, deep blues from woad that required weeks of processing and careful oxidation. The smell rose from these vats in the evenings, acrid, chemical, alive, mixing with the sound of water wheels and the voices of workers calling out measurements and temperatures. By day, the Arno ran with dyed water, rainbow-hued and strangely beautiful. The finished cloth, then, was no longer English wool or Flemish weave. It was Florentine cloth, bearing the stamp of Florentine excellence, and merchants throughout Europe paid extraordinary prices for it. At the height of the industry, the arte della lana alone employed some 30,000 workers directly and another 10,000 indirectly, and the guild produced around 100,000 lengths of finished cloth each year, a staggering volume that supplied the wardrobes and tapestries of kingdoms. The Calimala and Arte della Lana were not merely trade organizations. They were among the 7 greater guilds, the Arti Maggiori, that held the political power of Florence itself. You could not participate in government, could not hold office or influence policy unless you belonged to one of these guilds. The guilds were pathways to power, and the wool trade was the greatest of all pathways. The merchants who mastered this trade, who understood how to source English fleece, coordinate with Flemish weavers, manage the dyeing process, and distribute the finished product across Mediterranean trade networks, these men accumulated wealth that seemed almost infinite. They built palaces. They became the men whom kings and popes had to negotiate with when they needed loans. They became the invisible rulers of their city. The wool trade was the beating heart of Florence, the reason the city existed as a center of commerce rather than just a local agricultural hub, and it had made the city rich beyond what most medieval cities could imagine. But wealth alone does not build empires. What builds empires is the infrastructure of wealth, the systems, the trust, the intelligence networks that allow money to flow without the merchant having to risk his own body by riding a horse across mountains and through bandits from London to Aden and back again. This is what the Medici family understood better than anyone else in Florence. This is what set them apart. By the year 1400, Florence was governed by guilds, medieval organizations that had evolved from craftsmen's associations into something more like exclusive trade unions that held political power. The wool merchants had their guild, the silk traders had theirs, the bankers had theirs. If you wanted any kind of power in Florence, you needed to belong to a guild, and you needed to be wealthy. The guilds held the seats on the signoria, the ruling council that made the laws, set the taxes, and decided the city's foreign policy. The great families vied for power within this system, constantly maneuvering for position. the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Peruzzi, and dozens of others, all scrambling to increase their influence and their wealth. It was a system designed deliberately to distribute power in such a way that no one family could grow too large, that no one faction could dominate. And it worked, after a fashion, keeping Florence stable and preventing any family from making themselves into absolute rulers. But it was also a system full of cracks, full of ways to bend the rules if you were clever enough, and the Medici had an almost supernatural gift for finding those cracks and slipping through them, always just within the letter of the law. The symbol of Florence's wealth and aspiration was its money. The florin, first minted in the 1250s, was a small gold coin, no bigger than your fingernail, stamped with a lily on one side and the image of St. John the Baptist on the other. For over a century, the florin had been the standard currency of Mediterranean trade. If you wanted to do business in Alexandria or Venice or Genoa, if you wanted to buy spices from Asia or cloth from the north, you did business in florins. The florin was to the Renaissance what the dollar is to the modern world, the currency of empire, the measure of value, the proof of power and creditworthiness. And Florence made the florin. To control the florin was to control the flow of money across half the known world. To understand currency, exchange rates, and the movement of money across borders was to possess a kind of power that was almost invisible to those who did not understand finance, more subtle than swords, more comprehensive than laws, touching every person and every kingdom that wanted to trade. By 1400, Florence had been making the florin for more than 100 years, and the city's control over this currency was near absolute. In the shadow of the great cathedral, the Duomo, with its dome still unfinished, a vast and frustrating gap in the roof that had been there for more than 70 years, the wool merchants and bankers of Florence went about their business each day. They haggled over bales of cloth in the piazzas, their voices rising and falling. They met in back rooms in their stone houses to discuss interest rates and loans in whispers, keeping their conversations private. They kept their books and their ledgers in a code of numbers that only they and their trained clerks understood, and through those numbers they moved fortunes from place to place, building wealth in the quiet, private language of mathematics. Florence was a city of money, but it was also a city that was beginning to question what money should be used for. The old medieval city, with its focus on God and the church and the salvation of the soul, was dying. Something new was being born, a city that believed beauty might be worth something, that art might matter, that the things you built might outlive you and speak to generations yet unborn. The Medici family stood at the center of this transformation, and they knew it. They could feel the old order shifting beneath their feet, could sense the moment changing, and they were preparing themselves to inherit it. The man who started it all was not a great war hero or a famous reformer. He was not a visionary or a prophet or a brilliant philosopher. His name was Giovanni de' Medici, and he was a businessman, which is to say, he was a man who understood how money could be made from money without ever creating anything tangible. Giovanni was born around 1360 into a family that was already wealthy but not yet powerful, not yet prominent in the city's affairs. The Medici had been in the banking business for some generations. Giovanni's great-grandfather had lent money to the city, but they were minor players in a crowded field of banking families, and no one paid them any particular attention or thought they would ever amount to much. What Giovanni possessed was something rarer than inherited wealth and more valuable than gold. He possessed a kind of genius for seeing how systems could work, how money could move around the world without physical movement, how trust could be built and then leveraged into power over time, how small advantages could compound into empires. Around the year 1397, at an age when most men were settling into comfortable decline, Giovanni made his first crucial move. He took control of a small bank that his family had been operating in Rome and brought it back to Florence, establishing a proper headquarters for his banking operations in the city on October 1, 1397. This is the date we take as the beginning of the Medici Bank, though at the time it was not yet the most powerful bank in Italy, and no one who knew about it imagined it ever would be. Giovanni was in his late 30s, a careful man, deliberate in his actions, cautious in his decisions, and he moved slowly but always with purpose. While other bankers of his era were content to make money from everyday commerce, lending to merchants, exchanging currencies, keeping deposits safe, Giovanni began to dream of something larger, something far more ambitious. He dreamt of the possibility of becoming the banker to the church itself, of capturing the papal account and holding it. The Roman Curia, the administrative apparatus of the papacy, was the wealthiest institution in Christendom. It was wealthier than most kings' treasuries because tithes and donations poured in from every Catholic church and every Catholic believer across Europe and beyond, from pilgrims and the faithful, from rich bishops and poor peasants. The Curia needed bankers to move this money from one country to another, to collect tithes from bishops and monasteries and local churches all over Europe, to disgorge funds for construction projects and wars and diplomatic missions and everything else that the church required to operate. For a banker, securing the papal account was like having a claim on an infinite fortune. Every year, more money flowed into the account, money that could be moved, invested, loaned out, and profit taken. By 1402, Giovanni had managed through careful negotiation and the building of relationships to secure the account of Pope Boniface IX. This was a significant step forward, a proof that he was trustworthy with large sums, but it was not yet the great prize he was seeking. The true moment of genius came years later, when Giovanni befriended a man named Baldassare Cossa. Cossa was an ambitious cardinal, a man of political sophistication who was rising through the ranks of the church leadership. Giovanni became his banker, handling his accounts and his money with discretion and skill. When Cossa had the opportunity to become pope in 1410, seizing the position through the complex politics of the church, he took it, taking the name John X13 and ascending to the throne of St. Peter. He did not forget his old friend Giovanni. The Medici Bank was given control of the papal treasury, all the money flowing in and out of the church's headquarters in Rome, all of the vast sums that the church collected from the faithful across Europe. This was more than wealth. This was access to secrets, to knowledge of every large financial transaction happening in Europe, to information that could be used to predict the future and advantage the bank. It was power that multiplied itself endlessly, and the Medici would use it for generations. The Rome branch of the Medici Bank, established through this crucial connection and this access to papal money, became wildly profitable almost immediately. It generated some 60% of the bank's total profits, a vast fortune that flowed back to Florence and made the Medici family richer than they had ever been, richer than they dared to dream, richer than most princes. Giovanni de' Medici was careful with this money. He did not spend it on ostentatious displays or monuments to himself or his family's name. Instead, he invested it carefully. He expanded the bank to other cities, established offices in Rome and Venice and Naples, building a network across the known world of commerce. He developed careful systems for moving money across long distances safely, for collecting information about exchange rates and market conditions in different cities. He trained his sons in the business, teaching them how to think about money, how to calculate risk, how to build trust with powerful people. When Giovanni died in 1429, he left not just a vast fortune to his heirs, but a system, a machine for making money that was perfectly designed to work without his presence, a system so elegant and so well constructed that it would continue to generate profit even as circumstances changed around it. Giovanni had two sons. The younger inherited a portion of his father's wealth, but it was the elder, Cosimo, who inherited the bank itself and the responsibility that came with it. Cosimo was different from his father in temperament and style. Where Giovanni had been cautious and quiet, working behind the scenes and building relationships slowly over decades, Cosimo was charismatic and bold, comfortable in public, willing to take risks. He moved through Florence like a man who believed the city was already his, even though it was not yet. He began to spend the bank's money more openly than his father ever would have, to lend money to the government in exchange for political favor and influence, to sponsor artistic projects that bore the Medici name prominently. He was brilliant at this new kind of power, the power of patronage, the power of being the man everyone in the city needed money from. Within a few years of taking over the bank, Cosimo had made himself indispensable to the functioning of Florence. He had also made himself dangerous to every other powerful family in the city. There was an old Florentine law, one of the foundational principles of the Republic, that no one family should hold too much power, that wealth and influence should be distributed among the great families to prevent tyranny. The Albizzi family, which had ruled Florence for the previous generation and thought of Florence as their city, watched as Cosimo's wealth and influence grew year after year. In 1433, feeling their power slipping away, they struck. One of Cosimo's war captains had failed to conquer the Republic of Lucca, and the Albizzi used this military failure as a pretext to arrest Cosimo on charges of treason. They imprisoned him in the Palazzo Vecchio, the great fortress of the city, the seat of government, in a small tower cell called the Alberghetto, the small tower, and put him on trial. In that tower cell, Cosimo faced the prospect of death. The Alberghetto was not a place of comfort. It was a stone chamber high above the city, where daylight came only in narrow windows, where the sounds of Florence below were distant and muffled. Cosimo knew that his enemies wanted him dead, that they hoped to destroy him completely, to wipe out his family's power once and for all. But he also understood something crucial. The Albizzi could not execute him without creating a dangerous martyr for his supporters to rally around, a symbol of injustice that would turn the people against them. He had another fear, one that haunted all men of wealth in this era, the fear of poison. His jailer, either through bribery or sympathy, could be convinced to share his own meals with Cosimo, tasting each dish first to ensure it was not poisoned. This small ritual, this daily proof that no one was trying to kill him through deception, became a kind of survival strategy. Cosimo negotiated calmly from his cell. He understood that exile was a way out, that he could preserve his life and his family, and that absence from Florence might teach his enemies a harder lesson than any amount of protest could. He negotiated an agreement. He would accept exile rather than death. In 1433, Cosimo left Florence and travelled to Venice, taking much of his money and his account books with him. He travelled first to Padua and then to the Venetian lagoon, arriving as a refugee, a man stripped of his position, yet carrying with him the knowledge that his network of supporters extended far beyond Florence. Venice, the great rival city to the south, received him almost as a prince, not from generosity, but from understanding. Cosimo and his bank represented opportunities, profit, connections. The Venetian leadership understood what the Albizzi did not, that the Medici were too valuable to destroy. This was a crucial moment in the history of both Cosimo and Florence itself. The machinery that Giovanni had built depended partly on the Medici's presence in Florence, but it did not depend only on them. The bank had branches in many cities, and money could flow through those branches even when Cosimo was not in Florence. Money that had been flowing into Florence now stopped. Merchants who had depended on Medici credit to finance their businesses found themselves unable to borrow. The city's wool trade, which required credit to function, began to contract. The dyers along the Arno found they could not get raw materials shipped in. The weavers could not purchase finished cloth to resell. Within a year, so much capital had fled Florence in reaction to Cosimo's exile that the business community rose up against the Albizzi. Cosimo had won without having to fight, had defeated his enemies through their own economic foolishness, through the simple fact that their city could not function without him. On October 1, 1434, exactly 37 years after Giovanni had founded the bank, Cosimo returned to Florence in triumph. He did not march in as a conqueror with an army at his back. He walked into the city as a businessman who had been wronged, as a man who had suffered unjustly, as someone who deserved to be welcomed home by grateful citizens. And Florence welcomed him. The exile had taught Cosimo a crucial lesson about power. The appearance of power was less important than the reality of power. A title meant you had to defend your power constantly. He had learned in Venice that power was most secure when it was invisible, when it flowed through channels that others barely noticed. He would spend the last 3 decades of his life, from 1434 to 1464, as the de facto ruler of Florence. But he never took a title. He was not the captain of the military, nor the head of the government. He was simply Cosimo, the man who lent money, the man who made things possible, the man who let others think they were in charge, while he controlled everything from the shadows. He dressed plainly, not in silks and velvets like other rich men, but in simple wool cloth, wearing his Medici understated style like a declaration of principle. He moved through the city without guards or ceremony, and yet everyone knew that if you wanted something done in Florence, if you needed resources or approval, or the quiet removal of an obstacle, you went to see Cosimo. He ruled, moreover, through marriage alliances. He arranged marriages between his family and other prominent Florentine families, weaving the Medici into the fabric of the city's power structure so thoroughly that to attack the Medici was to attack everyone. He built a network of trusted men, his factors and managers and account keepers, and gave them power and autonomy, knowing they would be loyal because their fortunes rose and fell with the family. This was the Medici genius, at its most refined. They understood that titles were chains. Kings and signors had to listen to their people, had to worry about revolutions and rebellions and assassination. But a banker who worked behind the scenes, who made himself indispensable to everyone, who never publicly seized power, but simply made everyone else's plans possible, such a man was nearly impossible to dislodge, nearly impossible to overthrow. Cosimo had discovered the ultimate form of power, the power of not having to defend power, the power of being needed rather than commanded. For the rest of his life, whenever Florence needed something done, whenever there was a problem to solve, Florence would look to Cosimo. And Cosimo, the quiet king without a crown, would provide. To understand how the Medici built their empire and held it, you must understand not just where the money came from, but how it moved, how it flowed, how it could be directed like a river. The banking system that Giovanni and Cosimo developed was radically different from any banking system that had existed in medieval Europe before them. It was based on a simple but revolutionary insight. Money does not have to be gold coin traveling from hand to hand across dangerous roads guarded by bandits. Money can be information. Money can be a promise written on paper. Money can be a piece of paper in a ledger that means as much as gold, as long as everyone who sees that paper trusts it, as long as the paper's issuer has a reputation for honoring their word. The fundamental tool of this system was called the bill of exchange. Imagine a Florentine merchant in London who needs to pay a Venetian merchant money owed for a shipment of silk. The merchant cannot simply carry gold coins across France. The roads are dangerous, bandits are everywhere, waiting for merchants with heavy purses, and traveling with large amounts of gold is risky and foolish. Instead, he goes to a Medici agent in London and gives him florins. The agent gives him a document, a bill of exchange, which promises payment in Venice. The merchant travels to Venice with the document rather than with gold. In Venice, he takes the document to another Medici agent and receives the florins he needs to pay for the silk. The Medici Bank has just moved money across 2 countries without that money physically traveling, without it ever leaving Florence. How did the bank make money from this transaction without breaking the church's law against usury? The answer was in the exchange rate. The merchant in London paid 4 florins to send the equivalent of 3 florins to Venice. The bank pocketed the difference, not as interest, which would have been considered usury and was forbidden by the church under pain of sin and damnation, but as the cost of the service, the cost of transferring money safely across distances. This was the Medici's great insight, their secret. You could make a fortune in banking without ever charging interest on a loan, because you could charge interest disguised as an exchange rate, hidden in the mathematics of currency conversion, in the complexities that only trained bankers could understand. This meant that the Medici Bank needed branches in many cities, needed to have a presence everywhere that trade happened. It needed agents in London and Bruges and Venice and Rome and Naples and other cities. It needed a system to communicate quickly between branches when prices changed or new information came in. The fastest ships, the fastest horses, the best information networks that money could buy. The bank's ledgers were written in a system called double-entry bookkeeping, a revolutionary method of accounting where every transaction was recorded twice, once as a credit and once as a debit, which meant that the books were always in perfect balance and every mistake was immediately visible to anyone who knew how to read the numbers. The Medici did not invent this system. It came from Venice, but they perfected it and applied it to the vast complexity of running an international bank spread across multiple cities. The bank had a hierarchical structure that was carefully designed. At the top was the Medici family in Florence, making the major decisions. Below them were the major branches: Rome, Venice, Naples, Milan. Each branch had a manager, usually a member of a family allied to the Medici, and a group of clerks and assistant bankers who did the day-to-day work. The system was designed to be profitable, but also to be controllable, to prevent branch managers from taking risks that could endanger the whole enterprise. The branches were not independent. The family in Florence kept tight control over what kind of loans could be made and what kind of risks could be taken. Every major decision had to be approved by someone in Florence. This was efficient, allowing money to be moved around and deployed strategically, but it was also fragile. When foolish managers took risks without permission, when they made bad loans to princes who couldn't pay them back, the whole structure could shake. By 1450, the Medici Bank was the largest bank in Christendom, larger than any competitor by a significant margin. It had branches in 6 major cities. It employed hundreds of people, clerks and accountants and messengers and money changers. It moved a volume of money that no other institution on earth could match, money flowing in and out and through the system like the circulatory system of Europe. It had become not just a business but a kind of nervous system for European commerce, the infrastructure that allowed trade to happen on a massive scale. And as the bank had grown, so had its influence on politics and culture. Kings and emperors and popes understood that if you wanted to make war or build cities or do anything that required large sums of money, you needed the Medici, you needed access to their credit. This is what wealth truly means, not possession of gold locked in a vault, but the power to direct the flow of gold through the world. The Medici had that power, and they were only beginning to discover what they could do with it. By the middle of the 15th century, Cosimo had accumulated such vast wealth that there was almost nothing left to buy with money alone. He had more money than most princes, more influence than most kings. What, then, did a man like Cosimo do with all that money when he already had enough to buy anything material? He bought beauty. Or rather, he commissioned beauty. He created it with his wealth. He bought the genius of artists and architects and sculptors and made them create works that bore the subtle mark of his patronage. This was partly penance. The Church taught that the wealthy owed something to the poor, that building churches and chapels and libraries was a way to atone for the sin of having accumulated so much wealth through the machinery of banking and finance. But it was also power. Every building Cosimo paid for was a monument to Medici taste, Medici wealth, Medici vision. When people looked at the beauty of Florence, they were looking at the Medici's money made visible. In 1420, the city of Florence had begun work on something it had been dreaming of for nearly a century: a dome for the cathedral, the Duomo. The problem was that no one knew how to build a dome this large. The cathedral's interior was too wide for any existing dome-building technique to work. The greatest architects in Italy had stared at the empty space and shaken their heads in defeat. For more than 70 years, the cathedral had a gaping hole in its roof, rain falling through into the sacred space, a constant reminder of the limits of human engineering. Then, in 1418, a competition was announced. The city would pay a handsome prize to any architect who could figure out how to build the dome, solve the problem. A young man named Filippo Brunelleschi, who had trained as a sculptor and spent years studying the ruins of Roman buildings, submitted a proposal that seemed impossible. No one thought it would work. It seemed mad, impossible, defying the laws of engineering and gravity. But Cosimo de' Medici understood something that most people didn't. What seemed impossible often simply meant that no one had found the right way to think about it yet. Cosimo helped finance the dome, providing the money when the city's own resources ran short. In 1436, when the work was completed, after 16 years of labor, the ceremony of consecration brought Pope Eugenius IV to Florence, and the city celebrated what it had accomplished. The dome, Brunelleschi's dome, was the largest masonry vault in the world. It stood without internal supports, held up by the mathematical genius of Brunelleschi and the resources of the Medici. When people looked at it, they saw a miracle, saw proof that human beings could do impossible things. When Cosimo looked at it, he saw the future. Cosimo commissioned the sculptor Donatello to create works for the city. Donatello was probably the greatest sculptor working in Italy at the time, and his works were revolutionary. They looked almost alive, as if they might at any moment speak or move or breathe. Cosimo paid him large sums to create statues for the cathedral, for the churches, for the public spaces. These works made Florence famous throughout Italy, a center of artistic innovation and excellence. Artists and scholars began to come to the city, specifically because Cosimo had gathered the greatest talent around him, had made Florence into a place where genius could flourish. Cosimo also began to collect books, to gather the works of ancient and modern writers. In Florence in the 1430s, books were rare and expensive. Each had to be hand-copied by monks or trained scribes, a process that took months of labor, and only the very wealthy could afford more than a few. Cosimo hired teams of scribes to copy the great works of ancient Greece and Rome, works that had been nearly lost to the Western world after the fall of Rome, works that had survived only in scattered monasteries and private collections. He built a library attached to the Church of San Marco, where the books were kept and where scholars could come to read them without charge. He hired a priest named Fra Angelico to paint frescoes in the monastery adjoining the library. Beautiful spiritual paintings that filled the small monastic cells with light and color and peace. The result was a center of learning and beauty, unlike anything that had existed in Europe for 1,000 years. This was Cosimo's genius. He understood that patronage was not charity, not just an act of piety. It was the ultimate form of advertising, the ultimate way to build a brand. Every sculptor he supported, Every building he financed, every artist he employed became a representative of Medici taste and Medici values. He was essentially creating a brand, not in the modern sense, but in the deeper sense of associating his name and his family with everything beautiful and good and true. When people saw a painting or a sculpture or a building and were moved by its beauty, were transported by its power, they thought of the Medici. When they wanted to do business with the bank, they remembered that this was the family that had brought beauty to Florence. Cosimo had discovered that beauty was not a luxury for the rich. It was an investment. It was power. Cosimo died in 1464 after ruling Florence for 30 years without ever holding an official title. His son Piero inherited the family business, but Piero was weak, physically and politically. He suffered from gout that made movement painful, and he could not hold power the way Cosimo had done, could not command respect through sheer force of will and intelligence. After Piero's death in 1469, only a few years later, leadership of the family fell to his son, Lorenzo. Lorenzo was only 21 years old when he took control of the bank and the family's political position. Yet from the first day, he moved with the confidence of a man who had been born to rule, who had been preparing for this his entire life. He was different from Cosimo and different from his father. Where Cosimo had been content to work in the shadows, Lorenzo was comfortable in the light, comfortable being seen and known. He was a patron of the arts like his grandfather had been, but he was also a poet, a diplomat, a personality whom people were fascinated by. Men were fascinated by him. He had an almost magical gift for making people feel that their interests were his interests, that what benefited them also benefited him. Lorenzo was also more daring than Cosimo had been, more willing to take risks. Cosimo had been careful with the bank's money, investing it conservatively and always maintaining a cushion of safety for bad times. Lorenzo began to lend more freely to princes and kings, accepting political favors in exchange for loans that were never quite repaid. He got involved in diplomacy on behalf of Florence, traveling to Rome to meet with popes, sending ambassadors to Milan and Venice. He seemed to believe that if you controlled the money, you also controlled the politics, and to a great extent he was right. For the first decades of his rule, it worked. Lorenzo made Florence into the intellectual and cultural center of Italy, the place where ideas were generated and where artists came to create. Lorenzo's education had prepared him for this role. He had been trained in poetry, in letters, in the ancient languages. He was fluent in philosophy and could discuss Plato and Aristotle with the learned men of the age. In 1469, the same year he took power, he participated in the giostra, the grand jousts and tournaments that were Florence's greatest public celebration, displaying not just physical prowess, but the refined taste and cultural sophistication that marked a Medici. In the evenings he would gather around him men of genius and learning. He became the patron of Marsilio Ficino, the philosopher and translator, and supported the Platonic Academy, an informal but powerful circle of thinkers who were rediscovering the works of ancient Greece and trying to reconcile Plato with Christian theology. In these gatherings, held in palaces and gardens, the intellectual foundation of the Renaissance was being laid. These were not dusty academic exercises. Men here debated the nature of beauty and love, the proper structure of society, the relationship between the divine and the human. The atmosphere was one of possibility, of doors opening onto new understanding. Lorenzo filled Florence with artists, sought them out and brought them into the city. He discovered a young man named Sandro Botticelli and paid him to paint the most beautiful scenes, languid, mythological, full of beauty and sensuality and meaning. These were the paintings for which Lorenzo is now remembered. Works like the Primavera, suffused with an almost dreamlike quality, as if the viewer had entered into a garden suspended between the natural world and the world of the mind. He found Brunelleschi's successor in sculpture and continued the tradition of commissioning the greatest works. But most remarkably, he created something he called the Sculpture Garden, an open space in the Piazza San Marco, where the greatest works of sculpture could be displayed and studied, where young artists could come to study the human form by looking at the works of the past and the works being created in the present. In this garden, a young boy came to study sculpture and drawing around 1488 or 1489. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti. He was 13 or 14 years old, the son of a minor Florentine official. While copying an ancient faun's head, a sculpture of a mythological creature, bearded and ancient-looking, Michelangelo made a choice that would change his life. He carved the faun with its mouth open, showing teeth and tongue, as if it were alive and about to speak, rather than mimicking the closed mouth of the original sculpture. Lorenzo came through the garden and saw the work. He studied it carefully, and then, it was said, he pointed out that an old satyr, an ancient creature, would not have perfect and regular teeth. Michelangelo understood the provocation, understood that he was being tested, and with chisel and hammer he worked furiously, breaking out teeth and drilling the gum to make it appear as if a tooth had been extracted long ago, leaving a gap and visible roots. Lorenzo watched this display of talent and will, and he made a decision. This boy would come to live in his household, would study alongside the greatest artists in Florence, would have access to everything that Lorenzo's wealth and position could provide. It was an act of patronage that would echo through centuries. These young men understood that they were living in an exceptional moment, a golden age. The money was flowing, the patronage was generous, and every idea seemed possible to achieve. Michelangelo would later look back at these years in Florence, in Lorenzo's house, among the philosophers and poets and painters, as the happiest of his life. He was surrounded by beauty, by genius, by a man who seemed to believe that there was no limit to what could be accomplished with enough money and enough will and enough vision. By 1475, Lorenzo had made himself into something more than a banker, something more than a ruler. He had become a prince without a title, the head of a city-state, a man whose opinion was sought by the greatest leaders of Europe. He was 26 years old and seemingly invincible. In 1479, when war erupted between Florence and the Pope and the Kingdom of Naples, Lorenzo made a decision that seemed reckless to everyone around him. He sailed directly to Naples, traveling by sea to put himself in the hands of King Ferrante, hoping through his charm and intelligence to negotiate peace. It was an extraordinary display of diplomatic courage. He arrived in Naples in December 1479, virtually placing his life in the hands of a foreign king. For 10 weeks he remained there, using every art of persuasion, appealing to Florence's sense of reason and his desire for peace. By March 1480 he had succeeded. The treaty was negotiated. Florence was saved. Lorenzo returned to his city not as a ruler who had conquered through force, but as a statesman who had prevailed through intelligence and courage. He had also, though he may not have fully realized it, made enemies. The old families of Florence, the ones who remembered when the Medici had been nothing, watched his power grow year by year and felt their own power shrink. The Pazzi family, one of the great banking families of Florence, were an ancient and respected house, older in some ways than the Medici, with old money and long tradition. But they watched Lorenzo monopolize the patronage and monopolize the politics, watched their own influence in banking and finance decline as the Medici bank grew, and they began to plot. They were not alone in their resentment. In Rome, Pope Sixtus IV had become hostile to Lorenzo. Sixtus had his own nephews, in particular Girolamo Riario, whom he wanted to advance, and he saw Lorenzo as an obstacle to papal ambitions. The Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, had his own grievances with Lorenzo. These men began to communicate with the Pazzi, and a conspiracy began to form, a plan to remove the Medici through violence. It would culminate in the most shocking crime the city had ever seen. On the morning of April 26, 1478, the city of Florence was celebrating Easter, the highest day of the Christian calendar. The great cathedral, the Duomo, was filled with the smell of incense and the sound of Latin chanting. Hundreds of Florentines had come to witness the Mass, dressed in their finest clothes. It was the moment when the priest elevated the consecrated host at the exact center of the Mass, when the whole congregation bowed in reverence at the moment believed to be the transformation of bread into the body of Christ. The plotters had chosen this moment carefully. At the elevation, when every eye in the cathedral was fixed upward, when the bell rang to signal the holiest moment, this was when the assassins would strike. It was the moment when all of Florence was gathered in one place, when the security around Lorenzo would be lightest, when the chapel would be so filled with devotion and focus that violence might be overlooked for the crucial first moments. Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano entered the cathedral in the morning. They knelt in prayer alongside the nobles and priests. The Mass proceeded with ancient ritual, the priest's voice rising and falling in Latin. Giuliano was positioned some distance from the high altar, unguarded, an easier target. At the moment of elevation, when the bell rang and the priest lifted the consecrated wafer above his head and the entire congregation dropped to their knees, a group of assassins moved forward. A man named Bernardo Bandini drew his dagger and lunged at Giuliano. He struck once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Giuliano fell to the marble floor, and blood began to spread across the stone, bright red against the pale surface. His body lay there, pierced repeatedly, mortally wounded. Another assassin, Francesco de Pazzi, attacked Lorenzo. But Lorenzo was faster than they expected, more alert. He felt the blade coming and twisted away from the first blow, feeling it slice through his shoulder but miss his vital organs. He was wounded, blood ran down his arm, but he was alive. He ran toward the sacristy, the chamber behind the altar where the priests prepared for Mass. His friends and supporters, seeing the violence, surrounded him and helped him push forward. He reached the sacristy door just as the assassins closed in. Inside, he found the great bronze doors, crafted by Luca della Robbia, masterpieces of the metalworker's art. These doors were the sacristy's greatest protection. Lorenzo and his companions pulled them shut, heavy and immense, and barricaded themselves inside. The door held. The assassins, outside in the blood-spattered cathedral, could not follow. Outside, Giuliano lay dead on the cathedral floor, his blood mixing with the holy water at the entrance, his body desecrated in the house of God. The priests had scattered in terror. The congregation had descended into chaos. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The conspirators had planned for this. They expected word of Lorenzo's death to spread through the city, but he had escaped. The conspiracy had been carefully organized, coordinated with other events. While the assassination was happening in the cathedral, other conspirators were supposed to seize the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of government. The Archbishop Salviati was positioned to lead a coup, rallying the people and moving against the Medici supporters. But the plan fell apart when Lorenzo survived. Word spread through Florence that the Medici were still in power, that the Pazzi and their allies had failed. The people did not rise up against Lorenzo. Instead, they began to understand that an ancient and respected family had attempted to murder the Medici in the holiest place in the city. The reaction was swift and savage. Within hours, the surviving conspirators were being hunted through the streets of Florence. Jacopo de' Pazzi, the elderly patriarch of the family, was captured. He was thrown from the Palazzo della Signoria, the same palace from which he had tried to seize power, and his body was dragged through the streets of Florence, desecrated after death, as Giuliano had been desecrated in life. One of the conspiracy's leaders, the Archbishop Salviati, was caught and hanged from the walls of the Palazzo della Signoria. He was a man of the church, a cardinal, and hanging him was an almost unthinkable violation of sacred law and church immunity. But no one protested. Others were hunted down and killed in the streets. The Pazzi family was destroyed. Their palaces were seized, their property confiscated, their name erased from the city records. Later, the artist Botticelli, the same Botticelli who had created such beauty for Lorenzo, would paint the faces of the conspirators on the walls of the Bargello fortress, a kind of permanent record of the city's vengeance, so that their shame would never be forgotten, so that the danger they had posed would be remembered for generations. Lorenzo's response to the conspiracy was not merciful, but it was calculated. He knew that if he responded with too much violence, he would create new enemies. If he responded with too little, the next conspiracy would succeed. He walked the knife's edge carefully. The conspirators who had lived by the sword died by the sword. Between April 26 and October 20, 1478, 80 people were executed. But he also worked behind the scenes to make sure that the people of Florence understood that he had not killed them out of vengeance, but out of necessity, out of a need to protect the city from chaos. By the time the dust had settled, Lorenzo had emerged stronger than before. The conspiracy had not weakened him, it had cemented his power. Florence now understood that if you opposed the Medici, you died. Lorenzo had learned that violence, when necessary, was a tool as important as money. The years after the Pazzi Conspiracy were the golden age of Florence under Lorenzo. Freed from the threat of internal opposition, he was able to rule almost as an absolute monarch while maintaining the outward forms of republican government. He had aged in the assassination attempt, but he had also been tempered by it. He understood now that power was fragile, that it had to be constantly defended, that beauty and culture and patronage were not enough to hold power. Power also required the will to do terrible things when necessary, to shed blood if it was required, and Lorenzo had learned that will. The Medici Bank had been created by Giovanni's caution and Cosimo's care. It had reached its zenith under Lorenzo, who used its resources to control Florence and to make his name synonymous with Renaissance patronage and beauty. But Lorenzo was not as careful with money as his predecessors had been. He lent too freely to foreign princes who promised much but delivered little. He spent too much on art and buildings and his own lifestyle, on diplomatic missions that didn't pay off. More dangerously, by some accounts, he dipped into the public dowry fund, the communal money set aside for poor girls to marry, using state money to finance his own activities. He also made a crucial mistake that would eventually bring down the whole edifice. He allowed his bank managers in distant cities too much autonomy, too much freedom to make decisions without approval from Florence, and some of them took catastrophic risks. The branches rotted one by one, each in its own way. The London branch had overextended credit to the Yorkist King Edward IV during the Wars of the Roses. As the conflict dragged on and Edward's position weakened, the loans were never repaid. The branch attempted to collect through Lancastrian rebels who had also borrowed, but when the Lancastrians were defeated in battle after battle, those debts too became worthless. By 1478, the London branch had collapsed, with total losses exceeding 50,000 florins, an astronomical sum that represented decades of accumulated profit simply evaporating. The Bruges branch, managed by the younger Portinari brother Tommaso, suffered an even more dramatic failure. Tommaso had loaned vast sums to Charles the Bold of Burgundy, betting that the powerful duke would remain a stable, credit-worthy borrower. But in 1477, Charles was killed at the Battle of Nancy, and his lands were divided. The entire structure that had secured the loans was dismantled. Tommaso's reckless management left the Bruges branch with debts of such magnitude that some historians have suggested the entire bank never truly recovered from this single blow. The galleys and trading ventures that the bank had financed went nowhere, returning nothing. The Lyon branch in France had its own troubles. Its manager, consumed by venality and personal greed, was slowly draining the branch's resources. Only the heroic intervention of Francesco Sassetti, a trusted lieutenant, saved Lyon from complete collapse, but it never generated the profits that were expected of it. The Roman branch, the greatest source of profit, the one that had generated 60% of all the bank's income, was beginning to decline as the papal account became less stable. Popes died and their successors looked elsewhere for banking services. The Medici had built their empire partly on the foundation of papal money, and when that foundation started to crumble, the entire structure began to shake. Lorenzo saw these problems and was aware of them, but he seemed to believe that the bank's fundamental strength would carry it through any difficulty. He was a man consumed with politics, with art, with beauty and culture. He was not a man who loved ledgers and numbers the way his grandfather Cosimo had been. He let the problems accumulate, hoping they would resolve themselves. He was wrong. In April of 1492, Lorenzo died. He was 43 years old, and his death was sudden and shocking to everyone. Florence and all of Italy had grown accustomed to his presence, to his skill at diplomacy and management. His son Piero inherited the family business, but Piero was not like his father. He was arrogant and impetuous. Where Lorenzo had worked quietly in the background, making decisions in private conversations, Piero moved openly and offended people with his casual display of power. More importantly, Piero had no gift for finance, no understanding of how money moved and flowed, no patience for the tedious work of managing the bank. Within 2 years of inheriting the bank, he had run it into a crisis. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy. His armies moved south through the peninsula like a flood, and when they turned toward Florence, Piero panicked. Rather than negotiate from a position of strength as Lorenzo would have done, Piero rushed out to meet the king and conceded to every demand. He surrendered the city's fortresses, he agreed to pay a huge tribute, and he humiliated himself in front of the entire city. The citizens of Florence rose up in fury. They expelled Piero from the city. The Medici, who had ruled Florence for 60 years, were suddenly in exile, banished, their power gone. Mobs sacked the Medici palazzo, tearing apart what had been one of the most beautiful private residences in Europe, destroying in moments what had taken generations to build. With the Medici expelled, the city fell under the influence of a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was a powerful preacher who condemned the excess and corruption of the church and of the rich families who had patronized the church's excess. He saw the Medici's patronage not as piety, but as pride. He saw the art they had commissioned not as beauty, but as seduction, leading souls away from God. In 1497, Savonarola organized what he called the bonfire of the vanities. Citizens were encouraged to bring their worldly possessions to the piazza, beautiful paintings, sculptures, books, fine clothes, jewelry, and burn them. The cultural treasures that the Medici and other families had spent generations collecting went up in smoke and ash. The artists who had created them, the patrons who had supported them, watched in horror as their greatest works were destroyed in the name of purity. Botticelli's paintings, or some of them, were said to have been consumed in these flames, and the aging painter himself turned toward religious devotion in his final years, as if to atone for the beauty he had created. The Medici Bank, operating in the chaos without the political protection the family had once provided, simply could not survive. By 1494, the bank's collapse was complete. The branches in Milan, London, and Rome had closed or were closing. The money that had seemed to flow without end had simply stopped flowing. The great machine that Giovanni had built and Cosimo had perfected and Lorenzo had commanded was shut down, dismantled. The family that had invented modern banking had learned a hard lesson about the nature of power. Take your attention away for even a moment. Let the system run without proper oversight. Allow incompetent men to manage distant branches, and everything can fall apart like a house of cards in a moment. The exile lasted 18 years. For most families, this would have meant the end of their story, the end of their power and influence. But the Medici were not like most families. Savonarola had ruled Florence for a few years, preaching fire and condemnation until the Pope himself grew tired of the friar's criticism of the Church's corruption and had him executed in 1498. After Savonarola's death, the city began to look for leaders again, for some kind of stability. By 1512, the Medici were back, not through military conquest, but through the simple fact that no one else could fill the void they had left, that no other family could command the respect and the resources that Florence needed. The Medici's return to power was sealed by an even more dramatic transformation. Giovanni de' Medici, the founder of the bank, had had a son, the elder Giovanni, who himself had had a grandson, a boy named Giovanni, born in 1475 to Lorenzo the Magnificent's second son. This young Giovanni had been destined by his father for the priesthood before he was even born, and he had been raised entirely within the church, educated by the best teachers money could provide. He was trained in Latin, in theology, in the diplomatic arts. He rose through the ranks of the clergy with remarkable speed, his family's wealth and connections opening doors that would have been closed to other men. In 1489, at just 14 years old, he was already made a cardinal, a position of extraordinary power and prestige. He spent his youth in Rome, learning the ways of the church, understanding how power flowed through ecclesiastical channels, mastering the art of accumulating influence. In 1513, at the age of 38, Giovanni was elected pope, taking the name Leo X. At that moment, a grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, a man raised in the church but never forgetting his family's worldly power, had become the head of the Catholic Church, the spiritual leader of Christendom. His election sent a shock through Europe. The enemies of the Medici realized what had just happened. One of the greatest families in Florence had just captured the papacy itself. Leo X was unlike the austere monks and reformers who had preceded him in the papal throne. He was a man who loved beauty and art and music and the pleasures of the world. He had been surrounded by these things his entire life. He had studied in the sculpture gardens of Florence. He had been educated by humanists and philosophers. As Pope, he turned Rome into a palace of culture, far grander and more beautiful than anything the Medici had done in Florence. He made Raphael the guardian of Rome's classical antiquities and put the great artist in charge of the architectural work on St. Peter's Basilica. He commissioned artists and architects, and he poured the church's treasury into great building projects. He was also, by most accounts, rather fond of money, of acquiring it and of using it to acquire beautiful things. It was said that he remarked, "God has given us the papacy, now let us enjoy it," though the authenticity of this quote has been disputed by some historians. But the sentiment captured something true about Leo. He was a Medici first and a Pope second. He knew how to consolidate power. His election as Pope meant that the family had recovered not just their city, but the support of the entire Christian world. But there were costs to Leo's magnificence. To finance the great building project at St. Peter's Basilica, to fund the papal court and its endless expenses, Leo authorized the sale of indulgences throughout Northern Europe. These indulgences, documents promising forgiveness of sins in exchange for money, were sold by unscrupulous preachers who made promises the church itself would have repudiated. By 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther, disturbed by what he was seeing, wrote his 95 theses criticizing the practice. Leo dismissed the matter as a small dispute among monks. He did not comprehend the importance of what was happening, did not understand that this criticism would eventually split the church and reshape Europe forever. The empire that Leo and the Medici had built would be shaken by forces they had helped unleash but could not control. While Leo was reigning as pope, his cousin Giulio, the illegitimate son of Giuliano, the brother killed in the Pazzi Conspiracy, was also rising through the church. Giulio had been raised with Leonardo da Vinci as a companion in Florence, had received the same humanist education as other Medici. He rose through the church's hierarchy with the same inevitability as Leo. In 1523, Giulio was elected pope, taking the name Clement VII. The Medici now had control of the papacy not just once but twice within a decade. When Leo died in 1521 and Clement took his place, the family seemed to have reached the height of their power. They controlled Florence, they controlled the church, they seemed to control the future itself. And then came disaster. In 1527, the army of Charles V of Spain marched on Rome. The soldiers, a mixture of Spanish troops and German mercenaries, sacked the city in one of the most brutal assaults ever visited on a major European city. The Pope fled, barely escaping with his life, taking refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo with only a handful of attendants. Churches were desecrated, citizens were murdered, treasures were stolen or destroyed. Rome, which Leo had made into a jewel of Renaissance culture, was reduced to rubble and chaos. The Vatican Library was ransacked. The treasures that popes had accumulated for 1,000 years were scattered or burned. Clement VII was trapped in his fortress, a prisoner in all but name, watching the city he had dreamed of beautifying destroyed in the violence of war. Clement VII's papacy never recovered from the trauma of the sack. He was a diminished figure for the rest of his reign. His authority weakened both in Rome and throughout Europe, his dreams of grandeur replaced by the struggle to maintain power in an increasingly dangerous world. When he died in 1534, the Medici's grip on the church began to slip away. The popes who followed were no longer Medici, and the family's control over the spiritual leadership of Christendom began to fade. But even as their power in Rome was declining, the Medici were extending their reach in a new direction, into a new kingdom. In 1533, Clement VII arranged a marriage between a young niece named Catherine de' Medici and the Duke of Orleans, the second son of the King of France. Catherine was only 14 years old, born into the Medici family, only to be sent north to a foreign court, where she would be an outsider and perhaps a pawn in games of power she did not yet understand. The marriage was not politically important at the time. The Duke was not heir to the throne, was unlikely ever to be king. But Catherine was a Medici, and the Medici understood that the future was often held by those who were patient and strategic. Her patience was rewarded. When the Duke's older brother died and he became heir, and then when the king died and the Duke ascended to the throne as Henry II, suddenly Catherine was Queen of France. The girl from Florence, who had grown up as an orphan after her parents died in the chaos of the Medici exile, who had even been held hostage as a young girl during the siege of Florence, had become the most powerful woman in one of the great kingdoms of Europe. The Medici had conquered another throne, not with swords, but with a marriage contract and the passage of time. Catherine lived as Queen of France for 13 years, during the reign of her husband Henry, and then as the regent and power behind the throne for nearly another generation after Henry's death. She brought Medici ways to the French court, the political maneuvering, the patronage of artists, the willingness to do terrible things to hold power. She was never loved by the French, who saw her as a foreign woman manipulating the throne, a foreigner who had supplanted the old French nobility in the king's affections. But she was respected, and she was feared, and through her the Medici name lived on in a new continent, in a new form, extending Medici influence into the very heart of French power. What they had lost in Florence and Rome, they regained in Paris, proving once again that the Medici were survivors, adapters, players in a much longer game than any single city or crisis could contain. After the chaos of the 16th century, after centuries of war and changing fortunes, the Medici gradually settled into a new role. They could no longer rule Florence as merchant princes, as hidden powers behind the scenes. Instead, they became the Grand Dukes of Tuscany, the hereditary rulers of a small state in central Italy. The title was more formal than the power they had wielded in the days of Cosimo and Lorenzo, but it was also more stable, more recognized by other nations and kingdoms. They were no longer the shadow rulers working behind the scenes. They were now the official rulers, and the people of Florence had grown accustomed to their presence, had accepted them as legitimate. The Grand Dukes of Tuscany continued to patron the arts, as the earlier Medici had done, but they were no longer at the center of European politics and power. The world had moved on. New powers, Spain, France, England, had risen and were competing for dominance. The age of the Italian city-states was coming to an end. But the Medici adapted, as they always had. They focused on what they had always been good at, the accumulation of art and beauty, the preservation of culture. Generation after generation, the Grand Dukes collected paintings and sculptures, manuscripts and jewels, ancient works and modern works. They built the Uffizi Gallery, a vast museum designed to showcase the greatest works of art ever created. They filled it with paintings by Botticelli and Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo, many of them works that the earlier Medici had commissioned, but many of them works acquired from other families and other sources, brought to Florence from across Europe. The Uffizi became the repository of Renaissance art, and Florence became the greatest museum city in the world. Not because it was the greatest center of creation, that honor had passed to other places, but because the Medici had been there at the moment of creation and had captured what they could preserve. In the 18th century, the Medici line began to die out. By the 1730s, there were no male heirs, and the line of succession had to pass to a cadet branch, a younger line of the family. The last of the Grand Dukes was a man named Giangastone, who lived in Palazzo Pitti and spent his days observing the city from the windows of his palace. A man worn down by the weight of ruling, by the knowledge that his line was ending. When he died in 1737, his sister Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici became one of the most important figures in the family's history. Anna Maria Luisa was not a Grand Duke. She could not rule. She was a woman living in an age when women were not allowed to hold political power, but she had something else. She had consciousness of history, understanding of what was at stake. She understood that the Medici line was ending, that the age of the Medici was over, that this was the moment when everything could be lost. And she was determined that what the Medici had built would not be lost, would not be scattered to the winds. On October 31, 1737, Anna Maria Luisa signed a document known as the Patto di Famiglia, the Family Pact. In this document, she declared that all of the artwork and treasures and manuscripts that the Medici family had accumulated over 300 years would never be sold. They would never be divided among the heirs. They would never be taken from Florence, never be removed from Tuscany. Instead, they would be preserved in perpetuity, held in trust for the people of Florence and for all of humanity. It was one of the greatest acts of cultural preservation in European history, and it was made possible only because a woman understood that power and money ultimately had no meaning unless you did something good with them, unless you left something behind that would endure and speak to future generations. The collections she preserved, the paintings in the Uffizi, the sculptures in the Pitti Palace, the manuscripts in the libraries, became the foundation of Florence's identity as a museum city, as a place where the greatest achievements of the Renaissance could be preserved and studied and appreciated for centuries to come. Anna Maria Luisa died in 1743, and with her death, the Medici line ended. The Grand Dukes of Tuscany continued under other families, but they were no longer Medici. They were rulers of a state that was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the politics of Europe. And yet, in a way, the Medici had won. Not through military power or political dominance, not through the kinds of power that other families sought and held. They had won through culture, through beauty, through the understanding that if you wanted to be remembered, if you wanted to matter after you were gone, you had to create something that endured, something beautiful that would survive you. The paintings hung in the galleries of Florence, the sculptures in the piazzas, the libraries filled with books, the buildings that soared above the streets and seemed to touch the sky, all of these were the true legacy of the Medici. They had ruled for a time, and then their rule had ended. But the beauty they had created lived on through the centuries, lived on still. The city of Florence still stands on the banks of the Arno, much as it did 600 years ago. The Duomo still rises above the red tile roofs, with Brunelleschi's dome soaring impossibly above the cathedral floor, defying the laws of physics and time. People still cross the Ponte Vecchio where the goldsmiths have their shops, as they have for centuries. The paintings still hang in the Uffizi, the same paintings that Lorenzo looked at in the sculpture garden, the same paintings that moved Michelangelo to tears. And if you walk through those galleries late in the afternoon, When the light from the Arno falls through the high windows and fills the rooms with a golden glow, you can almost see the ghosts of the Medici standing beside you, looking at what they built, at what they loved, at what they left behind. This is what power truly means. Not the ability to command, not the ability to wage war, but the ability to create something so beautiful that it outlasts empires, that it outlasts the memory of the people who created it, that it speaks to every human being who looks at it across centuries and cultures and says, yes, this matters. This is what it means to be human. This is what makes life worth living. And the Medici, for all their greed and their ambition and their ruthlessness, understood this. They understood it and they acted on it, and that is why we remember them still.